Good evening. My name is John Crawford. Uh, Among other things, I'm serving my 42nd year on the board of directors of the Tule Lake Irrigation District. My relationship with, but it doesn't go back as far as the relationship between my wife Louise and her sister Jeannie and cousin Linda, the Stastny girls that were Mike's closest neighbors when they were all growing up. And Louise just said one word. She said mischief, and she was not part of it. Mike's mom and my daughter, Jana, were classmates at Chico State and graduated in the same year. The Byrne family introduced me to the Lost River sucker. And I'll tell you how that happened. My dad and I, it was a late spring morning, and my dad and I were going fishing at James Reservoir. And we pulled up to the Bulls Creek Ford. And the concrete ford across there, the water was really high. We stopped and we looked it over. It was very high, but it was really clear. And a pickup pulled up behind us, a special pickup. It was Mike's dad. So my dad said, hell, if it's okay for Bob, it's okay for us. So away we went. And we skidded a little bit on the concrete and we got to the other side and pulled up and stopped him. Here came Bob and his specially designed pickup across the ford, pulled up, stopped. And my dad said, God, Bob, we would have never tried it if it hadn't been for you behind us. And he said, hell, Jack, I'd have never gone if you hadn't been in front of me. But the part I remember was in that clear water on that day, there were 100 Lost River suckers about that big on top of that cement slab. I don't know what was attracted there to those fish, but that little did we know, Mike, that sucker would be such an important part of our lives. Mike in politics, we were across the street over here at Tule Lake High School. Mike and I were sitting on the stage on chairs with Congressman Herger. And my English and Spanish teacher, Dorothy Johnson, who kind of like yours truly, she fancied herself as quite an orator. And she got up and gave a speech, and Scott's dad, she was also his English and Spanish teacher. And she made a fiery speech about water and homesteading and then got off on a few tangents. I didn't know what really it was about, but I know at the end that Wally Herder leaned over to Mike and I, and he said, is she on our side? And I said, I think so. And he said, that's good, that's a good thing. I think it was in 1992 that I made my first venture to Washington, D.C. With Mike Byrne. And the first morning that we were there, we were walking down the halls of the house, and we passed the office of Maxine Waters. And you know Maxine Waters represents the Watts District in Los Angeles, and you've heard her talking about, well, how close she is to President Trump. And I was kind of chuckling at the time as I walked by that office. Mike Byrne turns right into the office, and there's a half a dozen people standing there. And I thought, what in the heck are we doing here? And from a private office toward the back of the room comes a very, very attractive young black lady, pushes me out of the way, throws her arms around Mike Byrne and gives him a big hug and tells how glad she is to see him. And I knew I was out of my league at that point in time. One of the other trips that we made that trip was to visit the office of Leon Panetta, a good Democrat from California who ended up being Bill Clinton's chief of staff. And he had a chief of staff whose name was Linda Delgado. And I think about this every time that Bob Gasser talked about being recognized. He had high back leather chairs about this tall, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we were tired. So Mike and I did our thing for Linda Delgado. We went through our whole spiel, And Earl Donosky, who's the leader of Two Lake Irrigation District, is gently snoring over in the corner. And Linda Delgado said, you know, I appreciate your presentation, but she said, I can't believe that the congressman is going to come down on your side on this particular issue. And Mike said, well, Linda, he said, it's our last appointment of the day. He said, obviously you have the nicest chairs on the Hill. And he said, that's really why we're here. And she gave us one of these. I'll remember you, she said. And I'm sure that she does to this day. She remembers Mike. As long as we stayed on our own side of the fence, we didn't meet with staff people very much. We truly, truly didn't. And it's a pleasure for me to sit with John Snyder tonight, because those first trips were to see Congressman Bob Smith. And we saw the congressman. He retired from Congress, and Two Lake Irrigation District hired him as a lobbyist. So there were 2 years that he was out of office, and one of the years, Mike and I ended up back in DC, and here was Congressman Smith taking us place to place for our meetings. And it was his second year out of office, and the Republicans had convinced him to come back and be chairman of the Ag Committee. So Mike and I got to be TV stars, because every place we went in the halls with Bob Smith, there was a TV camera following Bob Smith around, asking him what he was going to do. Greg Walden came after that, and the family ties with Greg Walden are good. Mark Hatfield, the senator from Oregon, was chairman of the Appropriations Committee in those days. And he invited his chief of staff to come to a meeting with Mike Byrne and myself in Mark Hatfield's private office in the Appropriations Committee. And we sat on the end of a big, comfortable couch while Mark Hatfield sat on the other end, and we talked. Don Young from Alaska, Congressman Young, was the chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. He also invited his chief of staff to come to a meeting with Mike Byrne and myself in the office of the Natural Resources Committee. We were heading home one evening to go back to the hotel, and Mike said, no, we're going to a cocktail party. Cocktail party. Well, we went to a cocktail party hosted by Senator Alan Simpson from the state of Wyoming. And we walked in and got our name tag, and we were ushered over to Senator Simpson's table. And we sat and talked about cattle and water with Senator Simpson. It's hard to imagine how much influence his position with the Public Lands Council and the cattlemen, it opened so many doors for the Klamath Water Users Association and TID. We rode his coattails all the time. And all the folks that I just talked about, Mike would praise their leadership, about how they guide our vision for the Klamath Basin. But I can tell you one thing. If you asked them, they would say that they were educated on all these issues by people like Mike Byrne, and how important that is. We've been talking on the phone for 35 years, and those are not short conversations. They truly are not short conversations. We had a couple of them last week. Those people in those political positions, and those of us who work day to day with Mike, are so grateful for his counsel, for his wisdom, and for that curious sense of humor that none of us have any idea what it's about. And I think that those of us who've tried to give to our communities, Mike spent a lot of time away from his family. He spent a lot of time away from his kids when they were growing up. And I think that we all asked ourselves a couple of questions. We asked, was it worth it? Was it worth it? And did it make a difference? And I can't answer that question for myself, but I can answer that question for Mike Burr. Everything you did was worth it. And everything you did made a difference. And I'll say this, of all the things that I've done politically and in this community, I'm no more proud of anything than I am my friendship with Mike Burr.